Massignon personally for a long, long time, knew Corbin, knew Louis Gardet, knew Spuler, almost all the great Orientalists. Van Groenebaum was a very good friend of mine when I was a young scholar. I think that the knowledge that Allama Tabatabai had of Islam and of the commentaries upon it, this one person was greater than all of these scholars put together. And these great scholars, someone like Massignon or Gibb, would accept that. They would accept that. And to simply disregard this tremendous treasury of knowledge, simply going back to the text of the Quran, who are we? Who am I, as said Hossein Nasr, to interpret the Quran simply on the information I have, a few words of Arabic that I've learned? The Quran is the word of God for us. And this long tradition are different keys given in every day and age to different circumstances, different situations, different intellectual and spiritual and religious and legal needs of the Islamic community, all of which we must consider if we're going to write a serious Quranic commentary which would be applicable to our age and which would do for our age what the Razis and Tabaris and Qurtubis and so forth and so on, all the great commentators had done during Islamic history. I think the Islamic community as a whole really should be ashamed of itself in a certain sense of not being able to continue this tradition, except for a few exceptions, along those lines, because so much that is being written, not only by Western Orientalism, but by by Muslim writers who are modernized in one way or another, or fundamentalists at the other end of the spectrum, in fact, leave out this long tradition. I will give you one more example. The late Seyyed Qutb, the very, very famous Egyptian figure whom all of you know, considered to be sort of the grandpapa of modern fundamentalism in the Arab world. He was invited by the US government here. When I was a PhD student at Harvard, I was the head of the Harvard Islamic Society, so they called me up from the State Department that this man is coming and you should be his host. We spent several days together in Cambridge, from morning to night. He was a very nice man, very, very fine man. I was so sad when he was murdered by Jamal Abdel Nasser. And he was a good Muslim, but his intellectual vision was completely truncated. And he could not understand the intellectual challenges that the modern world presents to Islam. He was very critical of the way girls dress in Harvard Square and things like that. But the deeper issues that were involved, he was not aware of. And so we produced, during the last century or two, a lot of Quranic commentaries, which are either modernistic and disregard the Islamic tradition and traditional commentaries on one side, or so-called Salafi, Wahhabi types, who again, their whole thesis is going back to the Salaf and therefore disregarding all that came in between. And this is really a kind of hubris of the worst kind. How could we claim to know more about the Quran than Fakhruddin Razi? Why is it we do not study him and then add something or even criticize? But to disregard this as if it were not there is a very, very dangerous thing for the future of Islam as a religion and as a religious community. And then there comes, of course, the inner meaning of the Quran. The inner meaning of the Quran does not reveal itself so easily to everyone. You have to be able to go with it yourself in order to understand the inner meaning of the Quran. Jalaluddin Rumi, Maulana, says in his book, Fihi Ma Fi, which has been translated twice now into the English language, some of you may have seen it. He says the Quran is like a beautiful bride. You cannot cast her veil aside and see the beauty of her face without intimacy, without knowing her well. Not just anyone can pull that veil aside. And so the idea that existed throughout Islamic history, that the Quran has this outward aspect, the language, the grammar, the semantics, the sha'n al-nuzul, the condition under which the ayat were revealed, the history and so forth, contains inner meaning, and that inner meaning is atemporal, it's beyond the confines of a particular moment of history, and for that very reason, to get access to it is absolutely essential, so that the Quran would speak to us. The Quran is for all ages, it's for all generations, and it's the ultimate sense of pride to think that some scholar who's taken a couple of years of intermediate or advanced Arabic is able to open up the Quran and gain access to all of its meanings. You have to live a whole lifetime with the inner realities which we contain within our soul in order to be able to gain access to the inner meaning of the Quran. But meanwhile, you have these incredible commentaries by men and a few cases women who had, in fact, traveled this path but realized the inner meaning of the text. Now, to turn my attention to this very important question, how can the Quran be new? Its interpretation, that is, in the Quran itself, as we have as the title of this lecture. Let me mention what can be new, at the same time authentic. I'm completely opposed to the idea that everything new is good. If I believe in an age in which most things new are bad, spiritually and intellectually speaking. But there are also some good things. God never leaves his creation without the element of the good. لا تخلو الأرض عن حجة الله. The earth is never empty of the witness of God. God's witness is always there, otherwise the world wouldn't exist. But we have an occasion, an opportunity, and also a challenge, a very, very important challenge, which the Islamic world has to face. And the new interpretation in the authentic and positive sense must address itself to that situation. First of all, in traditional Islamic society, the whole ambience was one in which you breathed in the Islamic reality. The sacred was everywhere. We had no word for the secular. I always say there's no word in Arabic or Persian for secular vis-a-vis the sacred, profane vis-a-vis the sacred. And that is for a reason. In a sense, the sacred permeated everything. Within that context, different commentators took it upon themselves to express different aspects of the Quran. We have commentaries which are primarily lughawi, are grammatical, they clear up many grammatical difficulties of the sacred text. We have commentaries which one could call tarihi, which are historical, like Tabari's commentary and several others, which give us an inkling into Islamic sacred history and also into early Islamic history following the advent of the Quran. We have commentaries which are theological, in the sense of kalami, as the science of kalam developed in the Islamic world. And the most famous among those, of course, is that of Fakhruddin Razi, the great Asharite of the 12th century, wrote the most monumental commentary ever written on the Quran, Tafsir al-Kabir, the great commentary, which is essentially theological, but Razi being a great philosopher, scientist at the same time, there are also many non-kalami issues in it. We have Quranic commentaries which are essentially fiqh, which have to do with Islamic law. The Quran is the fundamental source of the Sharia. And there are Qurans, therefore, that deal with those chapters, the surahs, like Surah Al-Nisa, Surah Al-Tawbah, parts of Al-Baqarah, other places, which deal ultimately with Islamic law and not either spirituality or psychology or metaphysics or eschatology or anything like that. Then we have the Sufi commentaries. That's a long tradition going back to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. All of his commentary has not survived, only a small part of it has survived, but that's the first written Sufi commentary that we have at the end of the first Islamic century. And this tradition continues over the ages in monumental commentaries by people like Qushayri, Imam Qushayri, Ruzbahan Baqli, whose 20-volume commentary has never been published. Only 1 or 2 volumes have come out. By Maybudi in Persian, the beautiful Kashf al-Asrar, which is one of the masterpieces of the Persian language, my own mother tongue. By Ibn Arabi, the Tawil al-Quran of Qassani or Kashani, and coming right up practically to modern times. We have not had any major Sufi Quranic commentaries of the last century of the whole of the Quran, but we have had parts of the Quran by Sheikh al-Alawi, by certain Indian Sufis, by Persians and others. And then we have the philosophical commentaries on the Quran. Many Islamic philosophers did not write commentaries on the Quran, but 2 of the greatest did, starting with Ibn Sina, greatest scientist, philosopher-scientist of early Islamic history, who began to write Quranic commentaries, of which these modern scientific commentaries are really a caricature really, because he, being the greatest scientist of the day, was dealing with scientific and medical ideas of his times. He was the authority on it. But it's not saying, oh, this verse corresponds to Louis Pasteur, this verse corresponds to Newton's Principia. And since I have had early scientific training, like has Dr. Iqbal, we consider this to be absurd. Well, it's really an affront to both science and to the Quran. It wasn't like that, but it's very, very telling to read these commentaries. That is, what would, if you had a major Islamic scientist today, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist or chemist, we've had a couple of these people, none of them has written a Quranic commentary. Most people who have written scientific Quranic commentaries know nothing at all about science. That's one of the paradoxes. But what would they write? Ibn Sina still is a model for that. And then we have several centuries later, the person who more than any other devoted his time and attention to Quranic commentary, who was one of the major philosophers of Islamic history, Sadruddin Shirazi, whose commentaries now have been assembled, published recently in Tehran, in a 7-volume philosophical commentary upon the Quran, which is just inebriating if one is interested in the philosophical, metaphysical ideas, along with books like Asrar al-Ayat, The Secret of the Verse of the Quran, and other works. I will not burden you with titles. And so we have this philosophical tradition. And then, of course, from the very beginning of Islam, we had both Sunni and Shiite commentaries which were confessional. And these names I named are almost all Sunni commentators. We have Shiite commentators like Tabarsi, like Mullah Mohsen Faiz Kashani, many, many others that they're not as well known in the West as the Sunni commentators. But many of them are confessional. And they did not present the total Islamic spiritual universe because they didn't have to. Fakhruddin Razi lived in a political situation in which he could not have spoken about Shiism, and vice versa. Mullah Mohsen Faiz Kashani, living in the Safavid period, could not have done it either from the other side. But they're both extremely precious. It's very interesting that Allama Tabatabai, excuse me, Allama Tabatabai, in composing his Tafsir al-Mizan, always studied Fakhruddin Razi and other major Sunni commentators upon the Quran. He did not limit himself only to Shiite commentators. So we have this vast collection of commentary literature from different perspectives, with different angles. One of the things that can be new, and the most important thing that can be new in interpretation of the Quran, is to be able to have a total universal Quranic perspective, which cuts across both these disciplinary divisions and confessional divisions, and presents various views on the various ayat from different sources. Now, not all of the Quranic commentators would agree, because some of them were Shafi'i, they didn't agree with some Hanafi or Hanbali commentators of the same verse. We have many instances of that, especially when it came to Islamic law. Imam Shafi'i disagreed with some of the other great Sunni fuqaha. There's no doubt about that. But for our day and age, at a time when, thanks to international politics, more Sunnis and Shiites have killed each other in Pakistan than through the whole history of the subcontinent of India since Islam went to India in the last 10 years. When we are faced with such a situation, I believe the service that we can render is to show the universality of the understanding of the Quran over the ages, how much of it, in fact, is common between Sunni and Shiite commentators. And it's not something to draw out your sword and get into the field and fight against each other like the Ottomans and the Safavids would do, or other people did. I think this is one thing which is very, very important, this newness of the interpretation. Secondly, this is quite important, the Quran always spoke in the language of those whom it addressed. Just listen to my words carefully. It always spoke in the language of those whom it addressed. It wasn't that everybody walking the bazaar of Herat understood what Fakhruddin Razi was saying, obviously. It was always an intellectual, spiritual elite in the correct sense of the term, I mean economic and political elite, who understood him, and this percolated down into the common people through sermons. He himself would give sermons in the mosque in Herat, in which 1,000 people would come. Sometimes he would comment upon the verse of the Quran. But always the language was one which the Islamic intelligentsia at that time understood. Now we have a very important problem. We have two types of Muslim intelligentsia. Put aside the West for the moment. I'll get to the non-Muslims in the West in a moment. We have two types of Muslim intelligentsia. Those who still are products of the old madrasas, no matter how these madrasas were weakened by the British taking over all of the waqf of all the madrasas in India in the 19th century, and other things done by Muslim governments themselves, not only by colonial governments or what the French did in Algeria. Anyway, nevertheless, it survived. We have people who are intellectuals in the real sense of the term, but are still products of what remained of the madrasa system, and still remains of the madrasa system. I've been one of those people who's been blessed by having studied in both educational systems for many, many years, both at Harvard and with the greatest traditional masters in Iran, in Tehran and Qom. So I know that that's still alive. But the majority of people who call the Muslim intelligentsia are people who are either trained in the West or trained in Western institutions in the Islamic world, which happen to have a Muslim name, but whose curriculum, whose division of the sciences, whose epistemology is taught to the students, worldview is totally non-Islamic. And many of these people are very pious people, but intellectually they don't function within the Islamic universe. The result of that is something very subtle, and that is a habit of mind. The habit of mind, habit of thinking, like we can say goes back to the meditations of Descartes, is to go horizontally from one concept to another, not to train the mind to sink vertically, deeply, in the vertical dimension. And the Quran is precisely that. We have a large number of educated Muslims whose mental training prevents them from really understanding the Quran as it has been understood over the ages. And the question of language is secondary. Yes, 20% of Muslims only are Arabic speaking. That doesn't mean someone who's a graduate of University of Cairo, whose mother tongue is Arabic, is not included in the group that I'm mentioning. That's a